In this interview, we're going to be discussing some research. So I just want to give you guys a quick little background on how it's done. So each participant has an earpiece, and then at random times of the day, without them knowing, it'll just beep, and they'll have to document their thoughts. Not just what they were thinking, but how they were thinking. Whether it was internal monologue, if it was visual, if they had a physical sensation. You're going to learn that it's not black and white whether you have an internal monologue or you don't. Everyone thinks different, and the way that they interpret their thoughts are different. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. So can you guys just introduce yourselves real quick?
So I'm Russ Robert, and I'm a professor in the psychology department at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas.
Okay. I am Alek Krumm, a doctoral clinical psych student, and I work with Dr. Hurlburt.
What sparked the interest in this subject?
Well, I think the topic of what's going on with somebody else is probably the oldest and the most interesting topic in the history of the planet. And
I agree.
So I would say that I've been interested in it as long as I can remember being interested in anything. I was particularly interested in how people think back in the 60s while I was working as an engineer, actually. But I was interested in other people around me, and I thought wanting to know how people think would be an interesting thing. And so I thought in 1967 or 8 or something like that, that randomly sampling people's thoughts would be an interesting thing to do. So in 1973, I decided I would go to graduate school in clinical psychology, and in the truck on the way to graduate school, it occurred to me how to build a beeper that was portable and that could be carried around and used in this sampling business. So when I got to the University of South Dakota, which is where I was headed for my graduate training, and the director of clinical training said, "Well, Russ, what do you want to do while you're here?" And I said, "I want to randomly sample thoughts." And he said they thought that was a good idea, but didn't think it was possible. And I said, "Well, I think I figured it out on the truck on the way here. I think I can build a beeper." And so I've been using a beeper to randomly sample thoughts since 1973. I built the first beeper in the fall of 1973.
Now, for the people that don't know what that is, can you go into a little bit more detail about what this beeper is and how it's used to track people's thoughts?
Sure. This is the beeper that I currently use, and I use an old-fashioned earphone that looks like this. And you plug the earphone into the beeper, and then you go about your everyday life, and every now and then it beeps. It beeps at random times, which I don't predict, and the subject in my research doesn't predict. And your task is to pay attention to whatever was going on in your inner experience at the moment of that beep. And then we get together and talk about it, and that's a joint effort, usually with Alek and me, or Alek and a few other graduate students and me. It's a tag team kind of a thing, usually, and your task is to describe what was in your inner experience. And that might be inner monologue, and it might be something else. I don't have a bias towards or against inner monologue. I'm interested in whatever your inner experience is.
And then as far as what I do, there have been many, many graduate students before me, and there are others currently too, but the bulk of my training is in building skill at the method. And the method, which I don't know if we have named yet, is Descriptive Experience Sampling, or DES as we call it. And that involves repeated interviews with the participants, during which we're asking them about their beeped experiences. And that interviewing is a real fine art. And so most of my training is in interviewing alongside Dr. Hurlburt and building that skill.
What are you trying to find out?
Well, I would say I consider us to be something like the Lewis and Clarks of inner experience. We're trying to describe whatever it is that's there. And if it's a mountain, we want to describe the mountain. And if it's a tree, we want to describe the kinds of trees that we find or whatever. So what we think is that inner experience is interesting. Thoughts and feelings and sensations and whatever are interesting. And we think that they haven't been described very well because we think we know what it takes to describe them. And so our task is basically descriptive. We call it descriptive experience sampling for a reason. We are trying to describe what the landscape of inner experience looks like.
Yeah, so it's very subjective. Obviously, you're interviewing people, and it all depends on what they say. But based on that, what has been the most interesting finding that you have found so far, in your opinion?
Well, I would push back on that. It's subjective in the sense that your experience is private. There's no way that we can get around that. So I'm totally in agreement with that. But
Okay.
but the word subjective generally has a very negative connotation, which says, well, my opinion is just as good as your opinion, and that I don't think is true, and in the slightest. I think what you have to do is you have to develop a method where people can give what I would call radically non-subjective reports about their experience. So we have to develop a way so that when we beep you, that if you are indeed as engaged in, say, internal monologue, then you would tell us about that inner monologue. And if you're not, then you would tell us about whatever it is that otherwise is going on in your experience. And that is not the case with most subjective things. Most subjective things are a matter of impression. If you're engaged in inner monologue, then you'll be able to say, yes, indeed, I was engaged in inner monologue. These are the words that I was speaking. This is the tone of voice that I had while I was speaking it and whatever. And if you're not engaged in inner monologue, then you won't be able to do that.
Would you say most people engage in inner monologue?
Well, that depends on how you define the level of the frequency of inner monologue. I would say most everybody can engage in inner monologue. So if you're trying to remember a telephone number, you're going to be saying to yourself, probably 702, whatever. So most people can, but very many people don't very often engage in inner monologue.
So I interviewed a girl that's in my class, and she genuinely says that she does not have an internal monologue. Like, she cannot think words in her head if she tried. Are there other people like that out there that you've interviewed?
Well, there are lots of people who do not have inner monologues. Your interview with her, I thought, was a good faith interview on both sides. It looked like you were trying to get her to tell you what was going on with her, and she was trying her best to tell you. I totally agree with that. But I don't think that she is necessarily to be believed about that. And that's not a criticism of her personally or you personally. I think people don't know the characteristics of their inner experience. And so I've interviewed lots of people who would come into my studies saying, I don't have inner monologue, and then we would beat them and they would be talking to themselves. And I've had a lot of other people, more on this side actually, who would come into my study saying, I do have inner monologue. And then we would beep them, and they would not, they would eventually decide, well, I didn't really have inner monologue. I thought I did, but I don't really.
Some people may have this internal monologue, some people may not, or maybe it's less active. Do you think that there's a mental health issue attached to the people that are more active with their internal monologue?
So to answer the first part of your question is have I done some explorations? The answer is yes. I have been reluctant to go in that direction. I see the work that we've been doing as sort of basic science work. Let's describe what's actually there. We should make our observations until we're pretty sure about them, and then we should start the theories about them. My guess is actually that the inner monologue is not the most interesting characteristic of inner experience. And if you want to do diagnosis, that there are other features of inner experience that are more important than internal monologue.
Let me add first the clinical conversation that we were just having. So I would say that almost everyone, at least in an academic setting, who comes into contact with our research basically immediately offers, well, why don't you guys, use this as a therapy or use this as a tool? And I agree with Dr. Hurlburt's principle about being somewhat reluctant about that. And I think that whether we get on board or not, psychology is moving in that direction and kind of paralleling what I think genetics started the personalized medicine movement. And that's kind of going on in psychology now, this idea that if we randomly sampled in some ways, almost always quite different ways than what we do in DES, though we can often be lumped in that camp. If we had an idea of what these people were like at random moments in their lives, we could tailor our therapies to them. And I think that's a really good notion. And I think that the methods are pretty misguided and could learn a lot, at the risk of sounding very conceited here, from what we do in DES. So I would add that.
He said that the inner monologue is not the most interesting thing, so obviously there's something that I am not aware of, and I'd be interested in hearing, maybe not one thing, but a few things that you could think of off the top of your head.
Dr. Hurlburt and I were just talking about this earlier this morning, so it's, maybe this is just a recency thing, but I do think that this is pretty wildly interesting. Like, for example, we have some participants who will say that at the moment of the beep, we just had somebody the other day, I've got this, I'm nervous, and I've got this heat sensation all over my body, right? Like I've got this bodily feeling. And then through some pretty careful interviewing, we're able to describe that actually at the moment of the beep, what this person is experiencing is just heat. They're experiencing a sensation. And after the beep, they can tell you, I guess it's nervousness. But really, in their direct experience at that moment, is just this physical sensation of heat. And that's quite a bit different, even though it's subtle, from what psychology typically says about feelings, which is that really we're in more or less these constant states of emotions, like now I'm nervous and now I'm content and now I'm angry and whatever, and that those emotions often have a physical or like a physiological component. But like at least for this participant and for other people we've seen, what she actually experiences isn't an emotion. It's a heat sensation, and she can label it an emotion later, but it begs some questions about, well, what would it mean if she had experienced it as nervousness as opposed to just heat?
But let me give you another example of something that I think is interesting, and that's a study that on women with bulimia nervosa, and Alek has been involved with trying to get this study published. But basically, what we have found, well, that bulimia is about distortions of body image and weight and shape and whatever, and they think that they spend a lot of time thinking about that kind of stuff. And so you would think that if you beep them, that's what you would find. And the answer is, well, yes, that's partially true. There is a somewhat higher frequency of bodily sensations, I guess I should say, in women with bulimia nervosa than in the regular population. But that's by far not the most interesting thing about them. Well, the most interesting thing about them is that they have multiple experiences, simultaneous experiences of very different things going on at the same time. So I might be thinking about you and noticing that you've got a blue shirt on, and I'm sort of drawn to the blueness. And at the same time as that, not separately, but simultaneously, I'm thinking that I've got an appointment at 1:30 that I got to get ready for. And at the same time as that, I am paying attention to the itch in the middle of my back. And at the same time as that. Now, most people don't do those kinds of multiple things all at once. They think about the blue of your shirt, and then they're done thinking about that, and they think about this appointment that I got coming up, and then they're done with that, and they think about the itch in my back or whatever. And the women with bulimia nervosa don't do that. They do it all at once.
A bunch of people came to me after I posted this. They were telling me about their experiences, and some people were saying that they had multiple voices in their head, like maybe one that was louder than the other, or if they were reading, they could still be reading the words, hear their voice, but also be thinking about other things at the same time. Is that kind of similar to what you're saying about the bulimia? Like how there's multiple processes going on?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense of, as a general description of the way some people actually are, I think yes. I would say, on the other hand, I would say that there are a lot of people who would say something like that and be mistaken about that for themselves. When people give you those accounts, you should develop a healthy skepticism about that, because people are
liars.
No, they're not. It's decidedly not liars. They're just decidedly mistaken about their own inner experience. And one would think, almost everybody thinks, that that's not possible. How could I be mistaken about my own inner experience? I've been experiencing my own inner experience for 16 hours a day, every day for the last however many years. How could I possibly be mistaken about that? And the answer to that is, well, first off, just an empirical fact. Many people are very mistaken about that. And the reason for that, I think, is that most of the time people are not directly interested in their inner experience. They're interested in whatever's going on. So when you're talking to me, presumably you're trying to understand what I'm saying to you and not paying much attention to how Ryan is experiencing what Russ is saying at this particular moment. In the internal monologue, people say, in the people who are posting to your blog, they're talking about internal monologue, and some of them are talking about this as if it was an inner hearing thing, and some of it are thinking about this as if they were talking to themselves. And there's very little that I've seen. I haven't read your blogs really too carefully, but there's very little recognition that maybe that's a different deal. Is inner hearing the same thing as inner speaking? The my impression from your readership is that they think they're talking about the same thing. But hearing and speaking are fundamentally different deals. So, for example, if you speak into a tape recorder and then you hear your voice coming back out of a tape recorder, same words, same person, same inflection, same everything, you would never mistake your own speaking for your own hearing. Am I talking into the tape recorder now, or am I listening to myself coming out? You would never make that mistake.
Exactly.
And yet, in the conversation in your commenters, they think that's the same thing. And so I would say that's evidence that they have a low fidelity view of inner experience. If they had a high fidelity view of inner experience, they'd have to figure out, well, is this the experience of talking or is this the experience of hearing?
I was talking to my friend, and I don't know if either of you could do this. I'm guessing you can based on the percentage of people I've asked. But can you look at yourself in the mirror, not open your mouth, and say a complete sentence in your head?
So I've heard you give that kind of report. I think that's an interesting question.
Or is that my experience that I am biased towards?
Well, I think if the question is, can I initiate inner speech? Yes.
Yes.
I think that's
a much more efficient way to ask that question.
For lots of people, that's probably true, maybe the majority. But I think there might be even a distinction between people who can kind of like free rein inner speak versus initiate. Maybe they can't make it happen, but it happens.
I've noticed that some people that I've asked that question to are very adamant that they could do it, and then there's some people that are just like, I don't know, maybe. But I feel like the people that are very adamant are experiencing similar experiences to me, just based on how they describe it to me.
Yeah, I think you should be skeptical of your own observations there.
Okay, so I'm learning from this whole thing is that this is a very broad subject, and every single person expresses their idea of their internal thoughts differently. Am I correct with that?
Yes, and let me give you one example of that. So if you ask about the word thinking, and you ask, well, what are you thinking about right now? That seems like a very straightforward thing. Everybody should know exactly what thinking means, and they can give a definition. Everybody could give a definition of thinking, which is pretty much like what Webster would give. But if you listen to people's reports about their inner experience at the moment of the beep, so the person says something like this: well, at the moment of the beep, I was thinking about whether I should have a hot dog or a hamburger. And then you ask for what the details of that, and they will say, well, I was speaking in an internal monologue, quote, should I have a hot dog or a hamburger, unquote. And somebody else will say, I was thinking about whether I should have a hot dog or a hamburger, and that person will have a visual experience of a hot dog and a hamburger side by side with no words whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And another person will say, well, I was thinking about whether I should have a hot dog or a hamburger, and that person will be tasting mustard and have no words and no pictures or whatever. Mm-hmm. And another person will say, I was thinking about whether I should have a hot dog or a hamburger, and that person will be feeling anxious because they can afford a hot dog, but they can't afford a hamburger.
So how many different ways have you seen people express their thoughts? Is it endless, or are there like maybe major groups specifically? So like some people are visual thinkers, some people are monologue thinkers, or is it just everyone experiences it differently?
It's a very complicated question. So thinking, first off, we have to make a clear distinction between the experience of thinking and some other kind of thinking. So there's a lot of kind of thinking that goes on underneath experience, what you might call unconsciously or whatever. That's a pretty bad word too, but outside of direct experience. What I would say is that people, maybe the most direct answer is that we divide the world up into the world of thinking, the world of inner experience, inner seeing, that visualizing, seeing an image, feelings, which is the experience of emotion, not just emotion, but the experience thereof. Sensory awareness, which is the noticing of a sensory characteristic, not because it's important in the situation, but because I happen to be noticing it. So while I'm talking to you, I'm drawn to the blue of your shirt, not because you've said anything about blue or because our conversation is about blue, but because when I'm looking at you on the screen, for whatever reason, I go blue. And then the last one is what we call unsymbolized thinking, Unsymbolized means I experience myself thinking, should I have a hot dog or a hamburger? But there is no symbol, whether that be words or imagery. So I'm experiencing myself as choosing between having a hot dog and a hamburger, and this is not an unconscious thing. It's directly right there. I'm making this choice,
Mm-hmm.
but there's no word hot dog and no visual image hot dog and no taste of mustard or hot dogs or whatever, and yet I'm thinking about it. So those are the five, what we would call five frequent phenomena. But it's not like the world falls into one of five categories.
Yeah. There's a lot of overlap, I'm assuming. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just want to add to this thinking conversation because I think that it helps illustrate a little bit of why we say people are so mistaken, because that's a difficult charge for folks to hear. So in an interview, for example, someone often will start by saying, well, I was thinking about blank, my mother's house. And assuming I could speak for Dr. Hurlburt here, when we hear thinking, it doesn't really mean much yet. And Dr. Hurlburt uses the phrase like dragging your feet. Like maybe you'll start to feel that inclination to say, oh yeah, I know what you mean, what we might do in real life conversation. But in the interview, we're very careful to drag our feet and say, okay, people say lots of different things mean thinking. So I don't know anything yet about your experience. And then in the course of asking questions, they'll say, well, I'm seeing the blue door on the house. And we might say, like, oh, so this is a visual experience. And very often I notice that participants look at us like, well, of course, I told you I was thinking. Of course, this is a visual experience. And that just helps illustrate, I think, that you don't know other people's experience. And you're therefore prone to assume that everyone is like yours. And that when you say, hey, I was thinking about this, and somebody says, oh, yeah, I was thinking about that yesterday, we all understand ourselves to be talking about the same type of experience, when in reality we might be talking about vastly different things.
That's why I think this whole thing blew up the way it did, is because people had no idea, that people didn't even think about how other people thought. And they just thought that I think this way, everyone else thinks this way. When we talk, we use the same words to describe the same things. But then in reality, when you take a closer look, everyone is doing maybe slightly different things.
Yeah, that is the nerve that you seem to have just absolutely struck here.
Yes, it has blossomed into a life of its own, and I was receiving thousands of messages, people describing their experiences, a lot of people telling me that they felt like they were alone because like they thought that they were thinking unusually, and then it turns out that they saw a bunch of people that were like-minded and they felt relieved from that. So I'm glad that this happened. Do you have any goals that you hope to come from this?
So I think that to the extent that it's given to me to know what's good or not, I think it's generally a good thing to have a view of yourself that actually corresponds to the way you really are. So I guess I'm still trying to contribute to that. I'm trying to say, we are trying to say, this is the way we think people are. We would encourage many other people to be doing the same kind of thing, and so I guess the long-term goal would be to get other people to do the kind of thing that we're doing as well or better than we're doing it.
The best thing that came from this is that people were able just to talk about their thoughts, and I feel like not enough people do that, and at the end of the day, this got a lot of people thinking, a lot of people used their brains, and a lot of people found people that were like-minded, and it helped them. So that's what I hope comes from all of this.